about shame, shame, shame. It's the name of her game. There's so much to do, and we're gonna speak true. So many to blame.
Hello to everyone out there in podcast land. You lucky people who are listening to us today, you have two incredible treats in store for you. First of all, we have an astoundingly wonderful guest. Her name is Lyndon Haviland, and she's going to tell us everything we need to know that we don't know already about federal funding. And believe me, we don't know a lot. So she'll be here a while. And even bigger surprise, you can actually see us now instead of just hearing us. So we've gone to some extra time and attention here to set up and light and put on our good clothes and look good for you. So very, very excited to tell you that. I am going to kick things over to Derek today. Derek is here with us as Derek Hopkins, Tom Andreessen, the Three Musketeers. And Derek actually is a friend of Lyndon's. So I'm going to make him do the hard work of introducing Lyndon.
All right, everybody. So our distinguished guest today, Dr. Lyndon Haviland, she holds a master's and a doctorate degree in public health from Columbia University's Joseph M. L. Mailman School of Public Health. She's completed an advanced management and leadership training at Harvard Business School. In 1993, she was awarded the John and Kathleen Gorman Public Health Humanitarian Award from Columbia University. She has more than 25 years of experience in domestic and international public health. She's worked with the UN Department of Public Information, the UN Foundation, UN Women, the UN Development Program, the World Health Organization, the International Organization for Migration, the International Medical Corps, and she's currently with the CUNY School of Public Health. She's advised heads of state agency leaders on complex issues such as maternal and child health, access to vaccines, sexual and reproductive health, tobacco control, health promotion, and disease prevention. So basically, by herself, she is saving the world.
And she knows everything.
And we're lucky enough to have her today. I actually met Lyndon in 2015 when she stepped down as, I think it was a year after she stepped down as chair for a nonprofit called Darkness to Light, which focuses strictly on prevention of child sexual abuse. I remember I was invited out there to their Ignite conference to go and speak. And afterwards, we were at a reception ceremony, and then this great woman walks up to me and tells me I did a great job. And then she starts talking, and the way that she was like framing the issue of child sexual abuse, her understanding of like all the interrelated parts and all the organizations and government, everything involved. I'm just sitting there and I'm trying not to just take my phone out and start taking notes on what she's saying while she's talking. So again, thank you. I know it's a long-winded introduction, but you deserve it, Lyndon. Thank you.
And here we are.
Thanks, Derek. Thanks, Derek. You can't see me, but I'm blushing.
Okay.
That was a lovely introduction.
So I thought a great starting point today would, because obviously our podcast is focused on research and just the economic landscape of child sexual abuse, and just we talked about it a couple weeks ago, just the dramatic, harrowing lack of funding. So I thought a good place to start would be when you were at Darkness to Light, how did you tackle the issue of funding?
Right. So it is a harrowing lack of funding for prevention, but it's a harrowing lack of funding because we don't even have a national dialogue about child sexual abuse. And what I was attracted to about Darkness to Light was Darkness to Light had a specific point of view, a singular point of view. And it was that it is an adult responsibility to prevent child sexual abuse. And unless we talk about it, we can't even begin to address it. So the idea was at Darkness to Light that we would begin to foster a national dialogue about the fact that 1, prevention is possible. 2, prevention is an adult responsibility. And our business model at Darkness to Light, thank God, did not rely on federal funding, because otherwise we would have been dead in the water.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's something that we've talked about with at least on the state level in Illinois, with ICASA funding. That's the state agency, and a lot of the nonprofits in Illinois that work on this issue have just got a
cut.
They just they're just cut, and it kind of seems like they're all fighting over these dollars, and all their organizations are so heavily dependent on getting these dollars, and there's just no outside. Can't find any outside assistance.
Yeah.
Lyndon, I think that's right. Go ahead.
Oh,
Jean, sorry.
the thing that struck me when I was reading the material, well, when I was researching you online, was you talked about the creation of these safe communities. And all I wanted to know was, where are they and how quickly can I go live in one? I've been working with this issue for over 25 years, and I don't think I have ever actually heard anyone say the words, it is the adult's responsibility to address this issue. You know, over and over again, as I have worked with survivors of rape and sexual molestation, yeah, you know, if you do any kind of panel, if there's audience participation, it always turns around to, why didn't you see it coming? In hindsight, what could you have done differently? You know, it's not your job to not be raped. It's not your job as a 9-year-old to make sure that no adults are messing with you. You know, was that a concept that you brought to the organization, or how did people even start thinking like that?
Jean, thank you for that question, because that is an essential question. First of all, I'm going to say it again. Prevention is an adult responsibility, and it is so inappropriate to shame and blame the victim that it makes my head want to explode. When even some of these things where we're teaching kids how to be safe, what the fuck is that? That is not their responsibility. That is so wrong. And often when we're at the point where we're teaching about consent or we're teaching about bodily integrity, the child has already been violated. So by the time we're having that conversation, now the child who's already confused gets to layer on shame on top of that. So I did not bring this concept to Darkness to Light. Darkness to Light was founded in Charleston, South Carolina by a group of adult survivors who got together to talk about an egregious example of child sex abuse, where a person from the athletic department from a hoity-toity private school had been sexually abusing children, as always, for a long time, and had, there was shame, there was blame, and there was that toxic layer of shaming silence. And so the adult survivors got together and said, screw that. We're going to tell our story, and we are going to bring this thing that is in the darkness into light, and we are going to talk about it, and we're going to force our community to talk about it and confront it. So I came in if I would say I had a skill set, it's to understand the interconnectedness of issues and the opportunity for taking something to scale. So I was brought to Darkness to Light to help take this to scale and nest it into a greater and national conversation, not a Southern conversation, not a Charleston conversation, but a bigger conversation. And so even, there are laws that have passed in the United States in some cases across the country, like Aaron's Law. So Aaron's Law is named for an adult survivor of child sex abuse, and it requires that children are taught about how to prevent child sex abuse. And although I think it's great to have children know the actual names of their actual body parts, and I'm a big fan of that, I don't think it's a child's responsibility to prevent child sex abuse, because we know if a predator wants to abuse a child, they will find a way.
Absolutely.
So to me, I want to say over and over, it is every adult's responsibility to understand the signs of child sexual abuse, to know how to prevent it. And here, the other thing is to know how to respond appropriately when a child discloses to a trusted adult. And one of the reasons this is so difficult is that 90% of children who are sexually abused are abused by someone who should be in their circle of trust, should be taking care of them. It's mom's new boyfriend, it's dad's new girlfriend, it's the coach, the pastor, the teacher, the PTO member. Those are the people who are often sexually abused. And until we actually confront that, we can't have a conversation about prevention.
That's fascinating, Lyndon. And I think I just saw a documentary about that school. Netflix?
Yes.
2 or 3 parts. Yeah, it was a new story to me. I have a standing list of documentaries that I work through as I have the stomach for it. So that's where you started. Well, that's really fascinating.
There was something that jarred for me was, so like when you're talking to, I remember our conversation like 2 weeks ago. You were saying you were talking to like a politician in Texas, and this like is embedded in my brain now. You're saying that the way you use like specific data points to target, use data points, and then you like match that to the demographic so that then you match that with a policy ask, so you could kind of speak to them. Use the existing data to speak to them in their own language. Would you mind like re-articulating that for everybody? Because it was just absolutely blew my mind.
Yeah, Derek, thank you for that. When you go in, I mean, you all know, when you go in to talk to someone, the first thing you need to ask yourself is, what do they care about? What is their passion? Because we're passionate advocates, all of us, about the prevention of child sex abuse and the care and treatment of those who have survived, right? They're no longer victims, they are survivors. So we want to give them every respect and every dignity and every support. But when we are talking to politicians, and remember that if 1 in 10 people is sexually abused in America, when you go to Congress, there's a good possibility, a high likelihood, that some of them are themselves survivors. And we know only about 30% of people ever disclose. And that for men, the disclosure often happens quite later than for women. And I really want to say that's because on some level, we expect women to be victimized, and we don't. And so it's more stigmatizing and more shaming for men to actually come forward. So I always keep that in my mind, because you never know. And working at Darkness to Light, both as acting CEO and then as chairman of the board, I was stunned how I could be in Starbucks, or I could be on the subway, or I could be in Congress. And every day brought a new disclosure of someone saying, I never told this to anyone before. So what I do is, if I go in to talk to a legislator, for example, Lindsey Graham is one of the senators from South Carolina, and he's been a huge advocate for Darkness to Light. And I asked myself, what is it that Lindsey Graham cares about? He cares about the military. He's taken 2 trips to the Ukraine. He cares about the military. And so if I go in to talk to one of his staffers, or I actually have a chance to speak with the senator, what I'm going to say is that, did you know that children of active duty military are at increased risk for child sexual abuse? And all of a sudden, his military focus, he really cares that, and he believes and he knows that military families have already given and made sacrifices to this country. And so something that affects their health and well-being, you can have a conversation with him about it. So that's important. Then if someone, for example, there are 2 members of Congress that I know or one member of Congress, Maggie Hassan, who's a senior senator from New Hampshire, she has a disabled child. So when I talk to Senator Hassan, I talk about the fact that for children with disabilities, they are at double the risk of child sex abuse. And if you have a female child who is both has a cognitive as well as a physical disability, the game is over. They're most certainly going to be sexually abused. So again, you have to find something that people are passionate about that allow you to bring up this terribly challenging topic. Because if I go in and say, I want to talk to you about child sex abuse, people don't want to talk about it because it's hard, because it happens in the context of intimate personal relationships. It's easier, Derek, as we talked about, to talk about human trafficking, because that seems like that happens into an other outside. It doesn't happen in the context of beloved family and friends and Uncle Jimmy and Grandpa Joe. That's not where it happens. Child trafficking. But let's talk about that. Let's talk about homelessness, right? Homelessness is a big topic right now. Karen Bass, the first female mayor of LA, has said she's going to make homelessness her top priority. Well, when I talk to friends, and I began my career in public health in a homeless shelter in Washington, D.C., what I didn't know then, but I do know now, is that anywhere between 80 to 90% of women who are in homeless shelters have had some form of sexual violence. Yeah. It's either child sexual abuse or domestic violence. And one of the problems when we talk about federal funding is there's funding for domestic violence, there's funding for human trafficking, and then there's no funding for child sex abuse. But child sex abuse is actually an egregious form of domestic violence. And 80 to 90% of the women in homeless shelters have experienced either sexual abuse at home or sexual abuse on the street or sexual abuse in an intimate relationship. So the woman and the child, male and female, who are at risk of homelessness and domestic violence are the same children and women and young men who are at risk of sexual abuse. So we have to stop divvying up these funds and thinking of it as a zero-sum game and say, what does it take to make a society where all children are free to thrive? What would it take to believe that that is our absolute responsibility?
Hey, Lyndon, those statistics are jaw-dropping. I'm curious, as you thought about making this a national conversation, how was the political angle? How did that figure into your strategy to make this a national conversation?
It was, well, first of all, let's talk about Darkness to Light's business model. We were doing training, so one-on-one training, or a trainer training, 10 or 15 people in a room. And to me, probably like you, Derek, I'm impatient for change. I believe right? I want to see change. I want to believe. I always call myself an impatient pragmatist, where I believe in people. I believe we all share this belief that every child should be protected. Mm-hmm. But then I'm a pragmatist. And if Darkness to Light is going to do training one by one by one, we're all going to be old and dead before we get to everyone and we convince everyone. So to me, I look at a grassroots and a grass top strategy, because I think if we push on both levers, we can meet somewhere in the middle and affect change. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure that people understand that President Biden, his son was, I'm not sure if I told you the story, his son, Beau Biden, who passed away, he has a foundation, which is called the Beau Biden Foundation for the Protection of Children. And he has that foundation because when Beau was the Attorney General of Delaware, there was a pediatrician who sexually abused and filmed himself sexually abusing an enormous number of children. And Beau Biden was the Attorney General who brought suit against him. And Patty Daly Lewis, who's the executive director of the Beau Biden Foundation, was his deputy in working on all those cases. And so the president and the first lady are very aware, not only of child sex abuse, but its link with domestic violence and its links with the long-term consequences of ill health, substance abuse, mental illness, poor educational attainment, and inability to form trusting relationships. So I do believe that this is a moment where we have leadership in the White House and in the executive branch where we can actually make progress talking about child sex abuse. I once had the opportunity to ask the then vice president what he had learned from his work. So if you talked to him while he was still the vice president and you asked him what his proudest legislative accomplishment was, he would have told you it was both the writing of and the reauthorization and the expansion of the Violence Against Women Act. And so I asked him, what are the lessons learned from that we can apply to the prevention of child sex abuse? And as the president is known to do, he gave me a 40-minute answer. But in that 40-minute answer, he gave us the kind of roadmap and the clues. The first was, he said, when we started the Violence Against Women Act, domestic violence was considered a private issue. And the police didn't even want to go in to a house where there was a domestic violence. It wasn't really covered, or it was covered in the press in kind of inadequate and blaming ways. And it went to Jean's question of, why didn't you just leave? Why don't they get out? There was not a nuanced understanding of the complex ecosystem in which domestic violence occurs and is perpetuated, and the laws don't support the victim. And the economics of control and grooming and all of that is not understood. So the vice president, the now president, said we had to train the media on how to cover it better. We had to train police officers and law enforcement who understand its complexity and their role in this. We had to start treating the victims as they are victims and understand the complex and multifaceted support that they need to get out of the situation get away from the situation, and to recover. So we did all of that, and we put it into policy and legislation on how to get it done. And so if you take that model, if you will, and you say, what do we need to do about child sex abuse? We need to learn to talk about it. We need to talk about it in its complexity and not blame the child, and to understand the whole ecosystem of grooming, right? The second is we need to train the press to cover it smartly, not in a salacious or kind of almost a way where we're all fascinated by the train wreck that is happening. Because I will challenge you, the next time you read about some major case of child sex abuse, what happens is about the third paragraph, something is in there where they've interviewed someone and they say, I was never really comfortable with coach so-and-so. Well, that's because we saw something and we didn't know it was our responsibility as concerned other adults to say something, and we don't have the vocabulary to talk about it. And we don't talk about the fact that child sex abuse, 90% of the cases happen when an adult is one-on-one with a child. So we need to put in our minds the responsibility of adults to minimize opportunities for predators to groom and prey upon our children. And so President Biden talked at great length about this and had great hope that we can, if we all as adults take this on and we all start talking about it and we don't let predators just lurk in the darkness and the silence, that we could make progress. And when the pandemic occurred, I immediately wrote something for The Hill where I talked about the fact that we know that children are now, locked down completely with predators. And that for children, now how are we going to, because most children will try to disclose, and the vast majority of disclosure happens in school. Well, kids weren't in school. So how are we going to learn what was happening?
As you've been speaking, Lyndon, I got stuck somewhere. I keep thinking, I'm one of the most pessimistic people out there when it comes to this issue. I am a survivor myself. But I think we kind of all get it. I think we all get it as a culture now that the children aren't to blame. Not too many rational people will say, like, well, the 5-year-old, should have stopped the monster. But I think people get stuck because they can't go to the next step. Well, then who do I blame instead? Because so many of the perpetrators are family, friends, acquaintances, professional colleagues. It's like nobody knows how to take the next step. And of course, no one ever wants to blame themselves. We all have a myth that the most important thing in the world is protecting our children. Then we run around and do the exact opposite. So that struck me for the first time as you were talking. How do you get to the next step? How do you then reach the adult and say, like, okay, we all understand that the child was victimized. We all get that. What do we do about pointing ourselves in the right direction? I guess I'm saying, like, how do you actually teach an adult that, fun Uncle Fred shouldn't be allowed near your kids?
Oh, Jean. Well, first I want to say I'm sorry for what happened to you, but I thank you for the work that you've done over this past 30 years working with survivors and talking about this issue, because the first thing is just that, is we need to raise up voices of survivors and talk about how. And a really important thing we have to talk about is that it happens in every demographic, because I think just as we like to think about it happening in it happens in poor communities, it happens in rich communities, in poor communities, in Black communities, and white communities. It is completely happening everywhere. And that's part of the problem, right? Because if it's happening everywhere, then what can we do about it? Well, the first is, and so Darkness to Light, if you go to their website, we have a wide range of resources that are free. And then we have our flagship program, which is called Stewards of Children. But some of the free resources are bystander intervention, how to understand what you see and what it means. And in some cases, as you know, maybe the uncle is doing something that makes you a little uncomfortable, right? You're like, oof, I'm not really sure, but maybe it's not abuse, because we don't want to believe it's abuse. Well, first of all, we need to start believing it's a precursor to abuse. That's one. And the second is we need to be unafraid to say to your uncle or your friend's brother, I'm sure you don't mean anything by that, but it just makes me uncomfortable, and risk having them be offended. Because the reality is, until we start, as we say, getting comfortable with being uncomfortable, nothing will change.
Right.
Nothing will change. And, if you think about the Olympic gymnasts or what happened in Charleston or what happened in USA Swimming, every one of those people who has finally had the courage to come forward, they say there were so many adults. They saw what was happening and nobody had the courage to even ask a question. And if they'd asked one question, all of our lives would be so much more different.
What is everybody afraid of? What would you say is the biggest fear that is keeping adults from speaking up, intervening, protecting a child? What is everyone so afraid of? I mean, obviously there are circumstances where it could risk their jobs. If you're in a domestic abuse situation at home, obviously it'll get you a beating. But I'd love to have your perspective on that, Lyndon. What is everyone really afraid of?
Well, I think it's complicated, Jean, and I guess I could turn that question back to you. But I would say my first response to that is people are afraid of being wrong. If I say this to you, and it's not, you're going to be offended, and then we're not going to be friends anymore. We're not going to be colleagues anymore. Somehow my question is going to rip the social fabric of our relationship. And so, so I just think that's the first, is people are afraid. They're afraid of that. To that end, though, I want to say child sexual abuse, when a child discloses, it is extremely rare that if a child disclosed, they're telling a lie.
Right.
This is one that, and so people need to understand that. And also people need to listen for it. We, in the original Darkness to Light, Stewards of Children, and we've just, this month, we're releasing a new and updated version. In the original, we had lots of cases where we gave examples where a child would speak to their kindergarten teacher. One kind of poignant example for me was a young girl came into her kindergarten teacher and she said, "Daddy ate my cookie last night." The kindergarten teacher said, "Oh, no worries. There's plenty of cookies in the cupboard over there. Get another one and sit down." The child was explaining that her father had actually performed an act of oral sex on her. And she tried to tell the person who was most important to her kindergarten teacher, but her kindergarten teacher didn't hear it. So as adults, we both need to learn to listen. We need to respond, and we need to be able to then take the next step. And, in many states across the country, all adults of a variety of places are mandatory reporters, which means if you suspect a case of sexual abuse, you are required by law to report it. I think it's Louisiana, if a teacher suspects it and doesn't report it within the first 48 hours of noticing it, they can lose their license, right? So I think their teaching license, that is. So I think as adults, we need to both know what our responsibility is. We need to be listening, and then we have to be bold, and we have to be okay with having a conversation which is icky and potentially, breaking the social fabric. I often laugh, and Derek knows this, saying that with the kind of statistics that roll around in my brain, I can stop conversation in a nanosecond and no one would want to talk to me. So we need to have to figure out a way where we can talk about the possibilities, that if we all were able to talk about child sex abuse, children would be safer. Communities would be safer. Families would be safer.
Thank you to our dynamic and world-changing guest, Lyndon Haviland. I got lots more things that I could say right now, but our time with her is up. I do have a chance to tell you, though, that there are all sorts of things going on with the Shame on You production team. We are launching a subscription program, probably in June. You will have access to visual podcasts as well as beautifully created visuals highlighting our data points and our faces and anything we think that you'll pay for. So I will have more on that when I talk to you in May. Have a wonderful, wonderful day. Keep listening, keep watching.
Like, share, and subscribe, you beautiful
Thank you.
people.
Thank you.